Good afternoon, everybody. We should be nearly ready to begin this afternoon's proceedings. Yes, I think we are all back. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Scolding.
Thank you very much, Professor Jay. Mr. Lloyd Evans and Mr. Corbett, just before lunch, I was about to ask you about activities that would be undertaken with children where their parents either might not be present or might not be supervising them closely. Corbett, from your experience, when and does that occur?
Yeah, so I think CCJW would say we don't sponsor or design any activities to separate children, therefore we have no problem. The fact that there's no design doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. In my own experience, I was raised by my mother as a Jehovah's Witness from as early as I can remember. She converted when I was a baby. My father is not and never was a Jehovah's Witness. So that meant that I was at meetings and on field service with my mother, an older sibling and a younger sibling, with only 6 years between all three of us. Sorry, actually 4 years between all three of us. And that was not uncommon for a mother to be a Jehovah's Witness without her partner being a member of the congregation. So I can remember occasions where I would go to a meeting for field service with my mother, but I would end up being in the ministry with an older male member of the congregation. I can remember traveling in the car with a person I thought of as uncle, and yeah, he was a lovely guy. A lot of time for him. At meetings, it's not uncommon for someone else to offer to help out a family such as that with numerous children. Your children come and sit with me. It wouldn't be uncommon for a child who's asleep in a pram or pushchair to be left in the foyer of the Kingdom Hall or one of the ante rooms of the Kingdom Hall so as not to wake them during the meeting. As I grew up, because my father was not a Jehovah's Witness, various older male members of the congregation sort of took me under their wing in a mentoring sense. They worked with me in the ministry. They took me on projects maintaining the Kingdom Hall and cleaning the Kingdom Hall, and generally tried to be a sort of spiritual father figure to me, given that I didn't have a father who was a Jehovah's Witness. So I think to say it can't happen because we don't design any occasions for it to happen is not strictly true. In my own experience, in a work context, for example, I once took along a 15-year-old doing work experience to the place where I worked. There was nothing there that was designed to harm young people. Nevertheless, we were forced to do a complete risk assessment because this was someone under the age of 16 now in the workplace. We had to do a complete risk assessment of all the things that could be a risk that we wouldn't have thought of as an adult, to the point of introducing him to the tap in the kitchen that might dispense hot water. Surprise, surprise. But we had to go through that process to assess the risk and mitigate against it.
And from your experience when you were a Jehovah's Witness, were any of those mitigating risk assessment factors ever thought about or considered when dealing with adults and children mixing together? And there's nothing in principle wrong with that. Of course there isn't. But was any thought given to issues around risk assessment or thinking about what the detriment might be of those sorts of activities as well as the positives?
Nothing that I was aware of. I think the only thing that sticks in my memory is that when attending, for example, a large district convention at a football ground, we were warned that people could walk in from the street and attend that event, and therefore we should not leave valuable things on our seats, which in the context of being in a Kingdom Hall, we would normally feel quite comfortable doing that. But we were reminded that there was that threat because of the venue. But other than that, I can't think of any occasion where there was any sort of warning of particular risk or any sort of assessment done.
Right. Mr. Lloyd Evans, how about you and your experience of, shall we say, unsupervised activities unsupervised by parents?
Am I allowed to very quickly just mention something about the authority of women very quickly, just for the sake of completeness?
Very quickly.
There are some instances in which women can have roles within the congregation involving, let's say, operating the sound equipment, but that's only if there's a shortage of men. So I just wanted to make that clear. In terms of the role of the access to children and the lack of supervision, or the instances in which children are separated from their parents while engaged in Jehovah's Witness worship, this is a very important point, because the inquiry has just heard evidence from PRA 5, which has been summarised, I understand, in which it was made very, very clear that PRA 5's abuse occurred as a direct result of items of religious worship where children are separated from their parents. In PRA 5's case, she would attend meetings for field service, and she would be assigned to work with other people in the congregation to whom she was not related. And in the case of Peter Stewart, he took the opportunity when taking these meetings for field service to say, I think I'm going to work with you. So this is entirely a common experience. When you are engaged in preaching as a Jehovah's Witness, you go to the meeting for field service. It's even depicted, I've referred to this in my evidence, it's depicted in one of the videos on jw.org, a video showing a meeting for field service. In addition, there are other aspects of worship identified in our evidence, and I'm talking about the XJW group as well.
Yeah,
baptism questions, Bible studies, and fatherless boys. The Shepherd Book, in its list of the responsibilities of service committees, actually includes assigning someone in the congregation to conduct a Bible study with, and the implication is with a minor. So, and there is obviously the instructions for members of the congregation to keep an eye out for fatherless boys. So there are many ways that we've identified in which children are separated from their parents while engaged in Jehovah's Witness worship at the encouragement of the organisation's literature. And I'd like the inquiry to consider that in light of the opening day of this hearing, where Mr. Shane Brady stated twice emphatically that that doesn't happen.
So what you're saying is whilst the familial nature, in a way, of a Jehovah's Witness congregation means that there is an essence of trust that lies between those who are members of that congregation, such that thought would not necessarily be given to things such as grooming, because they would all be seen as upstanding members of the Jehovah's Witness community. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. You think the best of your brothers. It's an international brotherhood. You are all unitedly serving Jehovah. Why would anybody in your congregation look to abuse you or look to exploit you in any way, especially when you are engaged in what is considered to be the life-saving preaching work? And yet we've seen in the case of PRA 5, and I can tell you it's happened in other cases as well, where the preaching work in particular has been exploited as an avenue of worship in which predators can access children.
Mr. Corbett, you had your hand up.
No, that's fine. Lloyd has covered the point.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just need to check something. Yes. Could I ask all of you to keep your videos on, even if you're not giving evidence, if you're a witness? Sorry, you may well have been given slightly different instructions. So Miss Davies, Miss Davies's video is currently off. I would ask if Miss Davies wouldn't mind turning her video on, if she wouldn't mind. But moving on, in fact, my next question was to Miss Davies to identify and ask, she her first witness statement identified that the definition of regulated activity in terms of who has various sort of risk assessments and checks doesn't really work in respect of the way that the Jehovah's Witnesses worship and spend time with each other, and that definition needs to be changed. I don't know where, Miss Davies, if you would like to answer why and in what ways do you think the definition of regulated activity needs to be changed?
Could I defer to Duncan for that question, please?
Of course, Mr. Corbett, the ball is now in your court.
Yeah, I think it's precisely for the reasons that we've just discussed, that many of the activities are things that occur by the nature of the activity, rather than being an activity that is specifically designed. So, for example, conducting a Sunday school might be a regulated activity because we expect that only children will be there. If one parent agrees to look after the children of several other parents while they go out and engage in field ministry as Jehovah's Witnesses, there is equally an adult with children in their care, but it's in an informal setting, and the congregation might say, well, we didn't make that arrangement. That's true, but it's occurred as a result of, as a natural byproduct of an arrangement that you made. And many of these instances, for example, sharing in-field service with someone to whom you're not related, taking part in construction or maintenance on Kingdom halls, all of those things are not specifically designed to separate children from their parents, but that will happen as a natural consequence of those things.
So your suggestion is that those in positions of trust in the context of any religious organisation, so for example the elders or the ministerial servants in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, in other religious organisations it would be other people, should be subject to an enhanced DBS check given the power and authority they may have over other members of the congregation. Is that right? Yes,
that position that they're given imbues them with the trust of the congregation. It's a stamp of approval, and reminding ourselves that this is viewed as an appointment that comes from God, not from the congregation. How could somebody in that position be deemed as a potential threat to my child? It's unlikely that a member of the congregation will consider that. So if the congregation is going to give the person that level of trust, then they ought to consider carefully to whom it's given.
And Mr. Lloyd Evans, if we can talk about issues of trust, we've heard from all three of you the fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses encourage very strong bonds of trust and confidence between each other, and you've talked about it, simply people not believing that other people could be guilty of sexual offending. What then happens when sexual offending is reported? What in your experience, Mr. Lloyd Evans, and I'll then come to Mr. Davies and Miss Corbett, what would then be the response of members of the congregation to the fact that such may have taken place in their midst?
Well, how would the members of the congregation wouldn't necessarily be able to react, because they would be largely kept in the dark about the entire process. So everything is done behind closed doors. Even the Shepherd the Flock of God book is out of reach to Jehovah's Witnesses. This is one of the problems with the child abuse policy, is that there is no single policy. It's spread across multiple documents, all available on a need-to-know basis. When an individual case comes to the attention of the elders, obviously they will handle that themselves, and they will take instructions from the branch office. Ultimately, the branch office decides whether abuse is reported, whether a crime can be brought to the attention of the local authorities. So there's no opportunity really for the congregation to have any say whatsoever. And frankly, a lot of the information that's coming to light in this hearing will be news to any Jehovah's Witnesses who are watching.
Mr. Corbett, if I could ask you, what I suppose I was interested in is whether or not In a number of the other investigations, and in fact in this one of the things that's been said, and there's been some research done on this, is that those with religious belief tend to believe well of others, something which obviously is good, but that therefore means that when sexual abuse does come to light, they may well be less willing to believe that it has happened, as a corollary of that trust and confidence that's reposed in other people. Is that something which you have seen from first-hand experience, or other members of your group have?
Yes, so certainly there is a propensity towards believing the person who has an established reputation as a spiritual person in the congregation. And having been appointed as an elder, one of the qualifications elders are asked to consider when appointing someone is he a spiritual man? So the fact that he has been appointed implies to the congregation that he is a spiritual man. Among the qualifications that the body of elders would consider is his reputation in the congregation. For example, it's unlikely that they would appoint somebody who spends many hours in the field service on his own without that being as part of group arranged witnessing, for the reason that nobody in the congregation knows that this person spends many hours in the ministry. So the lead has to be a seen lead.
Right.
They would rather the person spend fewer hours talking to others about his faith, but do it in the context where other members of the congregation can see him doing it. So that builds his reputation. He's now seen as a spiritual person because he's taking part in all of the things that Jehovah's Witnesses are expected to do. And once he's in that position, then it would make it more difficult for members of the congregation to consider him even as a potential person who might abuse children.
Miss Davies, do you have anything you wish to add to this? And would you mind keeping your camera on at all times if that's possible? Right, I'm not sure what's happened to Miss Davies. Miss Nichols, I was wondering, Miss Nichols, if you could try and find out what's happened to Miss Davies. I will carry on asking questions of Mr. Corbett and Mr. Lloyd Evans if Miss Nichols, my instructing solicitor, can make some inquiries as to whether there might be some technical difficulties. I know there were first thing this morning. So can I now turn Mr. Lloyd Evans and Mr. Corbett to practices and procedures? Now, as far as I understand it, there are 3 sources of current child safeguarding guidance. There are policies which the elders have, and the elders alone. There are policies which are for all members of the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then there are policies which for those who are unfamiliar with their teachings. I think that's right, isn't it?
That's the way I've characterised it in my evidence, but that's not necessarily the way that CCJW would characterise things.
Okay, so there are a number of different publications. One of the points that both of you, in fact, made is that therefore means there's no one corpus of material to which everyone can refer when deciding what to do if there are reports of child sexual abuse. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. So there's the May 2019 Watchtower, which is basically the only guidance intended for Jehovah's Witnesses. There's then the Shepherd book for elders, along with any supplementary letters that may be sent by CCJW. And there is the scriptural position document that's available on jw.org, which in my view has been written more to convey the policy in a way that's more palatable for outsiders.
Mr. Corbett, have you got anything you'd like to add in respect of the policies and procedures? In particular, obviously some policies are shepherd the flock of God, as I understand it, is something which the elders receive, but ordinary members of the congregation don't receive. Both yourself and Mr. Lloyd Evans and Miss Davies have indicated some concerns about the fact that that policy is kept, so to speak, amongst a small group of people. Firstly, can you explain why you've got those concerns? And secondly, isn't that no different to the fact that in any organisation you might have technical guidance, which is for those who've got more experience and expertise, and general guidance, which would go to the congregation or to members of the public who are worshipping. Mr. Mr. Corbett, if I could ask for you, and then Mr. Lloyd Evans, please.
Yeah, perhaps it would help to explain if I describe the attitude towards the Elders Handbook. Yeah. When you're given this, you're told, and in the copy that I have, it says that it's the property of the congregation. It's not yours, and I should have returned my Elders Handbook at the time that I was no longer an elder. Nobody came and asked me for it. So as it happens, I still have hard copy of it. If I had wanted that book spiral bound, say, to make it easier to refer to, then the instruction was I would have to do that myself. I could allow another elder to do it on my behalf. In extreme circumstances, I might ask a female member of the congregation, a sister, to do it. But if I did, I would have to watch while she did it to ensure that she wasn't reading it or making copies of the information. CCJW argues in their statement that the only information in this book is already available to members of the congregation in other sources. It's just that this book brings it all together. That would beg the question, why are only elders allowed to refer to it or have a copy or even to ring bind it for somebody else? So yes, you're right in saying it's usual for there to be technical documentation for some people and layperson documentation for other people. It's not usual for the technical documentation to be hidden and kept secret from lay people. It's just that they would look at it and say, this doesn't make any sense to me. I will read the For Dummies guide that helps me to understand it. But if they wanted to refer to the more technical information, if they wanted to understand it and go to that trouble, they could. It wouldn't be kept secret from them. That's the thing that's concerning.
Mr. Lloyd Evans, if you could come in briefly about that.
Yeah, just if you were crafting an ideal environment for child protection, you would want more transparency and not less transparency, because when you don't have transparency, when you have a rule book that's available on an eyes-only basis containing some rules that ordinary witnesses aren't aware of. For example, I referred to ask, don't tell policies, whereby sins can be forgiven if they haven't been disclosed for many years. These are in the Shepherd book, but ordinary witnesses aren't aware of them. And what happens then is you have an imbalance between those who know what the real rules are and the ordinary rank and file who aren't aware. And I can't see how this is conducive to child protection, because when you have a predator, say, who is an elder and he knows what the rules are, but perhaps the family of the child he's pursuing doesn't know the rules, I can't see how that's healthy.
The next issue I wanted to raise with you, and I'll ask Mr. Corbett first, but before I do so, Miss Davies, I believe you were unfortunately ejected from the meeting, but you are now back. Is that right? And can I ask you to turn your camera on, please?
Yes, I am back. My camera is showing on for me.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, it's now on, and I can see you in all your glory. But previously, if you wouldn't mind, just keeping it on. Thank you. Thank you so much. One of the other criticisms that all of you make in your witness statements is that the policies aren't necessarily followed in practice. Now, we have Mrs. Justice Leven in a relatively recent decision of the High Court called Lancashire and E&F, which is behind B23. Danny, would you mind getting up INQ 004963 009, please? This is the first time we've asked Danny to get something up, so it might take a couple of minutes. Chair and panel, behind B23. I don't think we need to go into the particular facts other than to say that according to Mrs. Justice Leven, information had been given to the elders of the congregation about alleged sexual abuse of a father of his children. The Jehovah's Witnesses were then aware that the father was still seeing the mother, although there was some confusion as to the exact nature of whether the children were supervised or weren't supervised when seeing their father, and the local authority ended up becoming involved. There was then an issue about what information the elders had or had not given or should not disclose in the context of the care proceedings. Mrs. Justice Leven makes various points about what she considers to be the differences between the policies. Now, I don't think we necessarily need to go to that, but at paragraph 18, she says, this can only raise a suspicion that the policies are drawn up, perhaps for public consumption, but not followed. I note that what has happened in this case does not appear to be an aberration by just 2 ministers, because it is clear from the documentation that's been produced that the particular person's allegations were raised and considered within a higher level. And this was all about whether or not there should have been reporting to the local authority or to the police of allegations of child sexual abuse, with the elders knowing of it but not reporting it, despite the fact that relevant policies seem to indicate that that is what should have happened. Mr. Lloyd Evans, is this an aberration, or is this something where you have experience or you understand that this has happened in other circumstances? Mr. Lloyd Evans, I'm afraid you're on.
Sorry, this isn't an aberration, and this speaks to what I was explaining earlier about there being really 3 types of policy: one for the rank and file, so to speak, one for outsiders, and one for elders. In this case, we're talking about child safeguarding policies, which the organisation has at some point, not while I was an elder, but since I was an elder, has realised that it's advantageous to at least be seen to be taking a proactive approach to child protection. So what's happened, as far as I can tell, is they've produced child safeguarding policies for the sake of having child safeguarding policies, even if, as in this case, and as observed by Mrs. Justice Levens, they haven't necessarily followed the child safeguarding policies.
Thank you. And Mr. Corbett, is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
I have nothing to add on that.
Ms. Davies.
I have nothing further to add.
Thank you very much. As far as I understand it, the most recent document that the entire congregation would have had, where issues of child sexual abuse and exploitation were discussed throughout, is the Watchtower of August 2019. Chair and panel, it's behind tab B27. Now, Mr. Corbett, you were going to tell us about the Watchtower earlier, and I stopped you and said we'd ask about it later. Can you just explain briefly, from your understanding and experience, what the Watchtower is and how it's used?
Yeah, in the late 1800s, a man called Charles Taze Russell began publishing a magazine called The Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence, something like that. And the religion that he started later became known as Jehovah's Witnesses. They took that name on, I think, in the 1930s. And so the term Watchtower has come to be synonymous with the religion. It's the main magazine that they produce, but the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society produces all kinds of literature, as well as the Watchtower magazine. They've produced a magazine that was called Golden Age and then became called Awake, and that's its current name. They also produce books and pamphlets and tracts that they use in their ministry.
But as I understand it, Mr. Corbett, the Watchtower is the subject of study. Miss Davies told us that first of all, and certainly upon instructions, Mr. Justice Chamberlain was told in another case involving the Jehovah's Witnesses that this is the authoritative guide, so to speak, to the way that Jehovah's Witnesses should approach. So one has various, if one looks at an example, let's look at Love and Justice in the Face of Wickedness, which is Danny CJW 0000600010. just so that we can see an example, we can see that it says Jehovah God hates all forms of wickedness, and one then has a reference to the relevant scriptural passage, how he must hate child sexual abuse, and then one can see at the bottom there are then sort of questions that I'm assuming right at the bottom, 1 to 3, according to this, how does Jehovah feel? So it's a sort of question and it's a Socratic method of teaching. One reads the article and then there are notes, which I'm assuming are used for guidance by the elders of the congregation to provoke discussion and understanding of what's meant. Is that right?
Absolutely right, yeah.
Now, I know that your group has produced a critique, shall we say, of this particular episode of the Watchtower. Now, I don't think we need to go into what you consider may or may not be scriptural inaccuracies, because this investigation can't make those decisions and determinations, neither would we wish to do so. But you make some criticisms as to the way that this particular document is drafted. Danny, would you mind getting it up again? CJW 0006010. The first issue you raise, we can see at paragraph 3, an example of it. Sadly, child sexual abuse is a worldwide plague, and true Christians have been affected by this plague. Why? Wicked men and impostors abound, and some may try to enter the congregation. Some professing to be part of the congregation have succumbed to perverted fleshly desires and have sexually abused children. So, Mr. Corbett, what's your concerns about the way that is worded and how that would be perceived by Jehovah's Witnesses, in your opinion?
Okay, so to put it in its context, this material is produced and disseminated by world headquarters. Every Jehovah's Witness in the world will be looking at this same issue of Watchtower, so it's not directed specifically at Britain, but the people who write and approve the publishing of it would be aware of what happens in Britain as well as in all other places in the world. What concerns us here is that this encourages a view of child abusers as being peripheral to the congregation. They're wicked men, they're imposters, so they've snuck into the congregation, or they are people who were in the congregation but have succumbed to some temptation. So both of these ideas paint a picture of somebody who is weak, who perhaps occasionally attends the congregation. They certainly would not portray the idea of someone in an appointed position, for example, and yet the people who wrote and approved the article would be aware of the figures produced by the Britain branch, which indicated that 107 accusations against elders and ministerial servants were made over a period of 10 years. If a Jehovah's Witness were to know that one accusation a month almost is being made against appointed men, elders and ministerial servants in their congregations, they would be shocked to hear that, because this article portrays elders as the people. In fact, at the end of this paragraph, you've got one example, how elders handle instances of serious wrongdoing. Elders are portrayed in this article as the people who handle the wrongdoing, who bring the wrongdoer to justice, who help him to restore his spirituality, who comfort the congregation, who assure the victim and the parent. There are a whole series of phrases in the article that refer to elders in the context of the person who hears the report and who handles the report and makes sure that the law is obeyed in those circumstances. There is not a single reference in the article that suggests an elder or ministerial servant could be a perpetrator, but we know that 107 were in Britain, or in England and Wales rather, I should say.
Against 107.
and we know that the Australian Royal Commission found 108 elders and ministerial servants who were accused of the 1,006 perpetrators identified there. 108 were elders or ministerial servants at the time when they committed the abuse. 28 of them, incidentally, were appointed after a first complaint had been made against them in the Australian case. We don't have any such figures for Britain on those kind of cases.
No, well, we're carrying out a slightly different investigation in the UK than they carried out in Australia. Mr. Lloyd Evans, you'd like to come in here. I can see your hand up.
Would it be possible to show on the screen paragraph 6 of the article?
Yes, it would. That is 011, a sin against the congregation. Is that the relevant passage you're looking at, Mr.
Yes.
Evans?
So you'll see there it says, and I just want to show this as an example of the very, very clever use of wording. This, in my view, is a masterful use of wording, so that when you breeze through it, it all sounds fine. But when you zero in on the actual words used and how they've been used, it all, in my view, unravels. It says, we do not tolerate in our midst individuals who unrepentantly commit wicked deeds or who bring reproach on the good name of the congregation. So you read that as a Jehovah's Witness, and you're immediately reassured that these individuals will not be tolerated. But the active word in that paragraph, which you're missing, is unrepentantly. So if they're repentant when it's brought to the attention of elders, then they will be reproved. And even though we're talking about someone who has sexually abused a child, they will in fact be tolerated in that they will be allowed to continue in the congregation because they've been found repentant. And the same is true if an individual is disfellowshipped because they've been found unrepentant. What then happens is they go into this cycle of forgiveness where they can circle back to the congregation and start attending after a while once they've been reinstated. Again, because they are deemed repentant, the congregation, quote unquote, tolerates. So this, in my view, this paragraph alone is a perfect example of how words have been very carefully used to give Jehovah's Witnesses the impression that everything's okay. It's only when you critically analyze the way the words have been used, which frankly Jehovah's Witnesses are not encouraged to do, that you realize where the loopholes are.
Can I take you to something which makes it, shall we say, slightly clearer that the issue, as with many religious organisations, is that repentance is important? If we go to CJW 0000600112, Danny, of the same document, under handling instances of serious wrongdoing, the elders are primarily concerned with maintaining the sanctity of God's name. They're also deeply concerned with the welfare of others and want to help anyone. In addition, if a wrongdoer is a part of the congregation, elders are concerned with trying to restore him if that is possible. And then if we could go to the next page, a Christian who gives into wrong desire and commits a serious sin is spiritually sick. In that sense, the elders are spiritual physicians. They endeavour to make the sick one. Their scriptural counsel can help him to restore his relationship, but this is only possible if he is genuinely repentant. So again, it seems clear that repentance is a part, shall we say, of any allegation of wrongdoing, and looking at that is important, as well as the deep importance of the spiritual welfare of those in the congregation who may have made the allegation of sexual abuse. Is that right, Mr. Lloyd Evans?
Correct. And it's worth flagging the fact that the organisation, again, if you read this article and you hear the language spiritually sick, and that elders are spiritual physicians who can restore someone who has sexually abused children, they have the power, they are described as having the power to restore someone who has sexually abused a child so that they won't do it again. We're dealing with a very backward impression of pedophilia full stop that completely underestimates the nature of pedophilia and the fact that when someone does abuse a child, they will more than likely go on and abuse others. But here, Jehovah's Witnesses are being told, actually, that's not the way it works. Elders have the power to intervene in this cycle and make it so that a pedophile is restored and cannot abuse again.
Is that not, Mr. Lloyd Evans, a slight exaggeration, because on the previous page, CJW 0000600011, it's made absolutely clear in this particular document that child abuse is a sin against the victim, against the congregation, against the secular authority, and above all, a sin against God.
Yes, but I don't see how that negates what I've just said, because something can be a sin, but the elders are the spiritual physicians who can cure the sinner. So the sin of child abuse is being condemned here. And I might point out that the words sin and sinner and sinfulness are used far more times in this article than the word crime will ever be found in this article. But the point is that having established child sex abuse as a sin, guess what? The elders are in a position to cure the sinner and restore them.
Mr. Corbett, can I ask you about, plainly, in the context of the worldview, the Weltanschauung of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the idea of something being a grave sin is of utmost importance to them because of the spiritual impact that would have upon upon your spiritual life and your life in the future. So it's a very, very serious issue. Why does it matter that it's couched in terms of sin rather than in terms of a crime?
I think in terms of the way the congregation deals with it and the way the elders deal with it, it doesn't matter. The problem arises because there is a confusion between sin and crime. It's obvious that this article, Lloyd has referred to it already, sinning, mentioned 25 times, violating a criminal law once, how evil that crime is once in the following article, reporting allegations of crime, not necessarily child sexual abuse, once. It's obvious that the emphasis of this article is about handling the sin. But CCJW is pointing to this as our child protection document. This is our policy on child safeguarding, and it's inadequate when it comes to handling the crime. If I could just point to paragraphs 12 and 13 of the article, for example.
Yes, that's CJW 000006000112, please, Danny. This is the spiritual physicians passage, is that right? And clearly they have a weighty responsibility.
So what I'd like to draw attention to is the question at the bottom of the page there. So this is the question that would be asked of the congregation. Do elders comply with secular laws about reporting an allegation of child abuse? Explain.
Yes.
Somebody would likely put their hand up in the congregation and say, yes, of course they do. What's interesting is the question does not ask, do elders report allegations of child abuse?
Yeah.
It does not ask, do they report all allegations of child abuse? It asks, do they comply with secular laws about reporting an allegation of child abuse? And then if you look carefully at where the answer is, in paragraph 13.
13. Sorry.
Yeah. So just underneath the bold print where the question is, yes, in places where such laws exist, elders endeavour to comply with secular laws. Well, what does endeavour mean? Do they or don't they? And what about in places where there is no secular law, such as in Britain, for example, where reporting is not mandatory? What happens in this case? And the answer to that is that elders immediately seek advice. I'm just trying to find the...
When they learn of an allegation, elders immediately seek direction on how they can comply with the laws about reporting it. As I understand it, that's by telephoning the legal department and the service desk of the Britain branch. Precisely.
Now a member of the congregation coming away from having studied this Watchtower, if they stepped out of their Kingdom Hall on a Sunday lunchtime and went to call on somebody in the ministry who asked them, I've heard that Jehovah's Witnesses don't report allegations of child abuse to the police, they would say, no, we've just talked about it this morning. Absolutely, we do. Elders report. That's what we just discussed.
Right. Okay.
So they come away with an impression of what happens, but the wording is accurate, strictly speaking. Yes, they do endeavour to comply. They call the branch tells them, actually, there's no law that requires you to report this. They make their assessment based on criteria that CCJW has submitted, and then they advise the elders whether or not that crime needs to be reported. So yes, the emphasis of the article is on dealing with the sin, because that's what elders are for. They're not there as detectives. They're not there to handle crime. That's the job of the police. But it implies that they do comply with the requirement to report, because it's implied there is a requirement, and it's implied that elders go along with it. And obviously it has to be written with an international perspective. Everybody in the world is reading the same guidance, and that's why, largely speaking, the direction is you call the local branch, because the branch is familiar with what the law is locally, but the article is written to give the impression that the crime has been handled as well as the sin, even though the emphasis of the article is very obviously on the sin. And we're not saying there's anything wrong with that, but to pretend that it's a child safeguarding policy that handles the crime is misleading.
And I think the third criticism you have of what's said in the Watchtower is the fact that the emphasis is placed upon parents to protect the children rather than the organisation to protect the children. Can we go to CJW 0000060015? This is Danny's showing us all the lovely JPEGs.
Yeah.
So, Danny, unfortunately, you seem to have got the JPEG up. I'm sure it will come up in a moment. Thank you very much, Danny. How to protect your children. Who have the responsibility to protect children from harm? Parents do. Your children are a sacred trust. Educate yourself about abuse. Maintain good communication with your children. Educate your children. And again, it emphasises the gross sin and the wicked deed of child sexual abuse.
One of the things that it mentions there in paragraph 20, learn about the kind of individuals who
Yes.
abuse children and the tactics they use. You mentioned not many minutes ago about the practice of grooming. I was interested, there was a study published just a couple of days ago on August the 6th by Susan Rain and Stephen Kent, who are sociologists at McEwan and Alberta universities, respectively. They said perpetrators prepare the child and significant adults and create the environment for abuse. They aim to earn trust and compliance while maintaining secrecy. And the advice there was, it's important for people to understand that most sexual abuse doesn't happen because somebody abducts your child from a public park. It's usually a family member, extended family member, or somebody they know in the community, whether religious or otherwise, who is most often responsible. Given what we've said about the familial relationships within the congregation, basically everybody in the congregation is an extended family member when you're a Jehovah's Witness. And we've seen already that religious ministers within Jehovah's Witnesses, elders and ministerial servants, are not above being perpetrators of child sexual abuse. And yet, parents are being told that they should educate themselves about this, while in the very same article being told that the perpetrators of abuse are wicked imposters who have crept into the congregation, people who have succumbed to sin, people who are on the edge of the congregation, not somebody who might be an elder or a ministerial servant in the congregation, for example.
Can I ask, as far as training is concerned, did any of did either of you, Mr. Lloyd Evans or Mr. Corbett, who were both elders, ever receive any training on spotting signs of children who may be subject to abuse? Was there ever a sort of training day run by any sort of safeguarding professional about how to identify this, about how to see that this might be going on in the congregation when you were both members?
Briefly, no.
No.
And Miss Davies, as a young person growing up in the context of the Jehovah's Witnesses, was there ever any discussion? Obviously, this was in the 1980s and the 1990s, so discussion about child sexual abuse was less. But one of the things that we have learned, certainly what has been said in some cases, is that, in fact, Jehovah's Witnesses, there's been quite a lot of spiritual material for quite a lot of time about that. Were you ever taught about the possibilities or the dangers of grooming as a child growing up?
I wasn't, but I'd like to refer to the witness statement JWA 00013, paragraphs 18 to 23.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. That's your second witness statement, if I remember rightly.
That's correct.
So that, chair and panel, would be tab behind tab A2. And which paragraph?
If we could start with paragraph 18.
Of course. This is JWA Danny 0. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is the list of documents that the CCJWs disclosed in terms of material in terms of training to protect people from abuse. You will note there that there's also ones included around incest and pornography. So if you obviously remove those from the list, because they are not specifically about child abuse, between 1981 and 86, there is only one article on CSA, and that is contained within the Awake magazine, which is primarily directed to the public for the preaching work. And then there is, if you discount the pornography article, which again does not address child sexual abuse, there is a 6-year gap in terms of the next article that deals with child sex abuse. And again, from the Awake magazine, and at that time I would have been 14. My abuse had stopped. It had stopped when I was around 11 or 12. But there's a heavy reliance on the fact that these things will be brought to our attention by our parents. Now, if our parents implicitly trust people within the organisation and they don't feel that it's a threat to their children, then it is not something that they are going to discuss within the family.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful, Ms. Davis, and thank you very much for making that reference to that particular passage. Can I just clarify and identify, incest is sexual abuse. It's simply sexual abuse within families rather than outside families.
Sorry. Yeah.
That's okay. That is absolutely fine. I think we've already talked about the fact that the elders would telephone the service desk or the legal office, and there would then be advice given as to whether there's a legal duty to report or not, and they would review and say whether or not it would be reported. Would the elders rely on what the service desk and the branch office told them about whether or not the matter should be reported to the police or the local authority designated officer? Mr. Corbett, if I ask you about that.
Yes, in fact, there have been instances I've heard of where elders have been removed from their position as elders for failing to follow that advice.
Right. And I think I will ask Mr. Gillis about this, but one of your, somebody else who has given witness statement has compiled a list of people whom she believes were not reported to the police, where there were, despite the fact that the elders knew them. And I think she's identified 19. Now, I think I'll deal with that for Mr. Gillis. So there have been a number of cases which have resulted in criminal convictions, ultimately, where the elders may have known of the abuse but didn't report it.
Yes, that's certainly plausible.
Yes. And you, as far as you're aware from your group, is then not reporting abuse to the statutory authorities, whether that's the police or the local authority, something which still continues, or is it a relic from previous days when there would have been issues across all religious bodies about not reporting things?
Okay, maybe I can refer you to the article, paragraph 14, the 2019, so that's CJW 0000600012.
This is the Watchtower, isn't it? 01.
Yeah, we were there just a short while ago.
A while ago, yes. B27, Chair and panel.
And we need the next page as well, please.
So that's 013 as well, please, Danny.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah. So the paragraph that spills between those two pages says, elders assure victims and their parents and others with knowledge of the matter that they are free to report an allegation of abuse to the secular authorities.
Yes.
This is the part of the policy that has changed over the years. In the 1970s and 80s, for example, an elder might call the branch and speak to somebody that he knew there. And in one example that I know, the advice was corner the man who abused your daughter in the Kingdom Hall and threaten him. Later on, it was realised, obviously, that people were bringing cases against Watchtower. The advice there was then changed. Elders were given specific advice: do not tell people not to report to the police. So it's a negative statement. And then this is the latest change, so slightly more positive: tell people that they are free to report to the police. But I think what this indicates is something about the culture. Why would you need to tell people that they are free to report to the police unless there is a culture that causes them to believe otherwise? The example that I gave at the beginning, where the advice was threaten the man, I asked the person who had been given that advice, what would you have done if the abuser had been a teacher at the school of your child rather than someone in the congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses where you attended? I would have gone to the police straight away, was his immediate reply. There was no hesitation. I would have gone to the police. And then I asked, why was that not your immediate response when someone in the congregation abused your daughter? Oh, well, we didn't understand about things in those days, was the sort of stuttering reply. But in essence, what it speaks to is the culture, which says, I must not bring the congregation into disrepute. This person who's committed the abuse allegedly is my spiritual brother. Maybe he can be restored. Maybe he's genuinely repentant. At this point in JW history, the process meant that a child would have to confront the abuser with a statement of what had happened in front of elders and the accused. Do I want to put my 12-year-old daughter through that process? Probably not. And so all of that hindered the reporting. So that's a sort of another criticism of the article, really, is that this is portrayed as a good thing, that people have the right to report, but actually what it really betrays is that there's a culture that makes people feel they shouldn't. And also, when we talk about the child confronting the perpetrator, notice while we're on this page, the footnote at the bottom of page 11.
Yes.
A child is never required to confront an alleged abuser. A parent or another trusted confidant may advise the elders of the allegation without exposing the child to further emotional harm.
Now, that's something that wasn't the case in the past, but is now the policy, that there is no longer a confrontation, shall we say, in the context of internal discipline.
And as a group, we welcome that change. However, the fact that this, along with the whole of the rest of the article, is written in the present tense, implies that things have not changed, that this is the way things have always been. So suppose somebody again, you're a Jehovah's Witness who has just finished studying this Watchtower article. You go into the ministry and you meet someone who left Jehovah's Witnesses because they were abused, and they were put through this process of confronting their abuser at a judicial committee. And they say, that's never right. I should not have been put through that. You say to them, no, we never allow that. We never force an abuser. We never force a child to confront their abuser. And effectively, you're saying to that person they're lying, because this article is leaving you with the impression that that's the way things have always been. It would have been more honest to give a history here and to say, we recognise that in the past this has happened. We recognise that was a mistake and it's caused harm to children. We're sorry for that. And now we have made this improvement. That would have been honest, open and transparent. This article attempts to paint the rosy picture that this is how things have always been.
I note the time. I know Mr. Lloyd Evans had his hand up. Chair, may we have our mid-afternoon break at this particular moment? And when I come back, Mr. Lloyd Evans, I'll pass to you. Thank you.
Yes, we'll return at 3 o'clock. Thank you.
Chair, I think everybody is now back and ready.
Thank you, Mr. Hughes. Council.
Thank you very much, Chair. If I may ask your permission, I suspect I will be another half an hour to 45 minutes with these witnesses, but I would like us, if at all possible, to start Mr. Gillis from the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. Would it be possible for us to sit slightly later today until 4:15 in order to, at the very least, begin his evidence?
Yes, we'll do that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Lloyd Evans, we were just dealing with the procedures, I think, for reporting out, I believe, just before the break, and you had your hand in the air. Please.
Yeah, it was in relation to the information in the May 2019 Watchtower that parents are reminded that it is their right to report to the authorities by the elders. And I felt it was important to draw attention to the ruling of Mrs. Justice Levens, which is tab B23, I think,
Yes.
which has some relevant information on this in paragraph 6.
Yes. Well, this is what the mother in this case, Danny, is INQ 004963-003 over to 004, please. This is at the bottom. The mother disclosed E's allegations to A and B. In her witness statement, she says.
So just first of all, if we could just zoom out again very briefly, we establish in, I think, paragraphs 3 or 4 that the mother is in fact remaining as a Jehovah's Witness. I just think it's important for context. And in the ruling in paragraph 6, we learn, it's a shame because it's broken across 2 pages there, but if we could pick up on the second page.
So this would be at the top of page 7.
Yeah, indeed.
For me, I had to think about the consequences of my actions. Is that?
Yeah. So yeah, if we could, so the one at the bottom there on the screen, the mother says, this is in 2016, by the way. So the elders met with the mother in 2016, having established that there was abuse, and it took them 2.5 years to report it to the authorities. And the mother says there, the elders informed me that I had to think about the consequences of my actions. As mentioned, I wanted to go to the police, but the message I felt I was receiving was that police involvement was not the appropriate thing to do. I fully accept that this was not what was being said to me, but this is what I was feeling. So again, this is from a believing Jehovah's Witness, and it very well illustrates the point that there's a difference sometimes between what one is told in terms of what their rights are and the tone in which that information is conveyed. In this case, seems to the impartial observer to have left the mother with the impression that it would have been favourable not to report. And this is a crucial distinction, because I've given evidence in my own submissions about a Watchtower article that refers to fleshly minded individuals. It's actually the 2018 February Watchtower, which describes fleshly minded people as the sort of people who insist on their rights and who take their brother to court. So the way it's conveyed to Jehovah's Witnesses is, just because you have the right to do something doesn't mean that you should do that thing. And I think that the Lancashire ruling very well highlights that aspect.
I think you identify that in your written witness statement, which we don't need to deal with, but like a number of religious communities who are bound up with each other, there is a view that you shouldn't necessarily report your brother for a crime, so to speak.
Indeed. And in his evidence, Mr. Gillies points out that as recently as 2017, in some of the guidance, witnesses have been told that the instructions not to take your brother to court don't apply to crimes, But unfortunately, when you have conflicting material such as the Watchtower, the 2018 Watchtower that I've referred to, which makes no distinction about crimes and whether you should report crimes or not, and when you have this long established culture of not reporting crimes and keeping things in-house, what tends to happen is, regardless of what's put in print, people prefer to err on the side of caution, especially if they feel as though their place in paradise might be uncertain if they were to make the wrong decision.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. If we can now move on to, there is obviously discussion within the Watchtower document of something called the Judicial Committee, and we've had quite a lot of discussion about the Judicial Committee. This is a committee which, as I understand it, is formed to deal internally with whether or not individuals can remain members if they have breached the rules of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And plainly, as has been identified in the Watchtower article, child sexual abuse plainly falls under that mantle, as does a number of other matters which one would expect for a scripturally inspired religion to do so, such as, you know, licentiousness, lasciviousness, greed, various other matters which would offend biblical morality, if one puts it that way. So one then has a judicial committee which is made up of elders. There would be 3 elders, as I understand it, on that committee. And as you've identified, Mr. Lloyd Evans and Mr. Corbett, both as elders, you may well have sat on those committees. Mr. Lloyd Evans possibly not. Mr. Corbett more likely to have done so. Are you given, Mr. Corbett, were you given any training in assessing witnesses, dealing with civil allegations, managing investigations in any way before undertaking the task of a judicial committee?
There is some training is given to elders in that regard at elders' schools, which are held every so many years. There is guidance in the elders' handbook, but as I think I indicated to you earlier, it's quite common for somebody to progress from being a ministerial servant to being an elder. They would then essentially be in at the deep end. They might be appointed an elder, and then it might be a few years before there is an elder school that they would attend. So essentially all they have is the handbook. There is no specific training course that you must go on before you're appointed as an elder. Your time spent as a ministerial servant is on the job training, so to speak, except that you never have any experience of handling judicial cases, because only elders are allowed to do that. So it would be a bit like a learner driver going onto the motorway for the first time. Yes, you sort of know how to drive, and you've seen some videos on how to drive on a motorway perhaps, but by definition you cannot have been there as a learner. So in a way you're thrown in at the deep end. The way that's dealt with is that typically, because there are 3, or for accuracy, sometimes more, but never fewer than 3 elders on a committee, what will generally happen is that a recently appointed elder would serve first with other elders who have more experience of serving on a judicial committee. So his first time would be in part a training exercise. The Elders Handbook gives guidance on I suppose you could say weighing the evidence of witnesses at a judicial committee, but primarily it talks about their spiritual standing in the congregation.
Yes. Well,
how much could we rely on their testimony, which would tend to weight itself towards someone who's already an elder or ministerial servant, perhaps.
Yeah. If we could have a quick look at that, we have behind tab B22 a copy of the extract from the 2015 Elders Manual, Shepherd the Flock of God. I know there is a more recent version of that, but I don't think it's changed materially in this respect. Danny, it's JWA 000009. I think that's 509005, paragraph 21. And I think maybe just to say by way of background, this is the information that elders would be given, but it wouldn't be information that would be generally available. And it obviously says things like child abuse is a crime, never suggest to anyone that they shouldn't report an allegation, make it clear that it's a decision for themselves whether they decide to do so. And then in a case where a brother denies an allegation and he has been accused by only one witness, now let's just be clear, for scriptural reasons, on the basis of various pieces of the New Testament, it's identified by the Jehovah's Witnesses that in order to be removed from the faith, or in order to be the subject of spiritual disciplinary action, if I call it like that, rather than secular disciplinary action, there needs to be 2 witnesses. And we've heard from PRA 5 that those witnesses need to be credible witnesses. And I think one can also understand from the fact that we've had a number of investigations and hearings by this point in time that it is unlikely that there would be a number of witnesses to child sexual abuse. It tends on the whole to be something which takes place in private, and therefore that may be, and an inevitable corollary of that may be, it may be more difficult to administer spiritual discipline, which is the role of the congregation. So I think if we take that as read, it says the elder should consult the branch office, etc. With regard to the accused, the following questions should be asked. What's his interaction with children? Does he admit to any activity? What's his response to why the accuser has made the allegation? Has he had to have counselling? What's his level of spirituality? Do all the elders believe he can be trusted? The following questions, can we go to the top of the next page, please, Danny? JWA 000009 006. The following questions should be answered with regard to the accuser. What's the level of their maturity? Is he or she serious? Is his memory consistent, or does it involve repressed memories? I think that's been removed from the 2019 version, if I remember rightly. What's the reputation of the parents? Whether the allegation should be shared with the new congregation. So this is to do with people moving. In fact, I must please forgive me, I think I got it wrong, the exact context in which this is being given. But I'm assuming similar sorts of guidance is given when you're deciding whether or not somebody should be admonished for their spiritual behaviour as an elder in respect of a judicial committee. Is that right?
So you're right in suggesting this is about when somebody moves. Yeah. It's pertinent to the case where an accusation is made and the person denies the accusation. In that case, the congregation, if you were able to bring up the previous page, actually the first sentence of paragraph 21 yes. makes clear it's when he moves to another congregation. So in such a case where there's no second witness, the congregation where the accusation is made will make a record of the accusation and keep a copy of that in the congregation safe. They will keep the details locally. In case a similar accusation should be made at some point in the future. So one way that the 2-witness rule can be satisfied is if a second person comes along and makes a similar accusation against the same abuser. Right. It doesn't have to be the precisely the same case, but the same abuser with 2 victims. Now the elders might say we have 2 witnesses. How can you do that unless you keep a track of the first one, is the question. So the local congregation keeps a track of the first case. The question then arises, what happens if that person moves to a different congregation? What happens to that locally held record? The answer is the congregation consults with the branch. And I think this is simplified in the more recent Elders Manual, but essentially the guidance is pretty much the same. It's the branch who decide, and they will probably liaise with the local congregation on the basis of questions like these, but the branch will then decide if and how much information should be shared with the new congregation from what the previous congregation has in its files.
So let's just take this as an example. So you will have a number of situations where you may have a situation where somebody somebody comes and says, I'm worried that my daughter's been sexually abused by a ministerial servant. Let's take the idea of PRA 5. And I'm worried about that. There's only one person who's been the subject of abuse. So even if a judicial committee was formed, there would be no possibility of that person ever being asked to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses.
The judicial committee would not be formed if there was no second witness. So unless the accused admitted the allegation,
yeah,
that's as far as it would go. There would be no judicial committee.
Okay, and so let's assume that for whatever reason there wasn't a referral to the police or to the LADO in those circumstances, and we've identified cases in which that hasn't happened. In those circumstances, would there be any kind of risk assessment of the individual within the congregation? Would the congregation even have any idea that there had been such allegations made? And if there is any risk assessment, who carries that out?
So again, this can be summarised in a huge imaginary flowchart where every branch leads to call the branch. It's essentially whatever happens, the end result is we call the branch for guidance on this. So the allegations, whether or not there's a second witness, the allegations would be reported by 2 elders phoning the branch. The branch would then decide what, if any, guarding measures need to be imposed at the congregation level.
Right, so there may or may not be.
Elders in training are sort of generically advised that they should keep a lookout for any behaviours like the person has children on his lap, or things of that nature that might cause others to be disturbed.
And if they were to move, again, it would be a decision for the branch and not the congregation. So you could phone up someone that you might have met and said, look, nothing's been proven, but I'm slightly worried about X. You might need to put something in place. You wouldn't dream of doing that.
You wouldn't. I personally wouldn't have, as an elder. I would have followed the instruction. Call the branch will decide. They will tell me, do I need to send anything to the new congregation, and if so, what information do I need to send?
And obviously within your witness statements, all of you identify your concern about the 2 witness rule when it comes to that. But in reality, this is an internal disciplinary investigation. Why does it matter so much, the fact that there are 2 witnesses? If this is just to do with whether you can attend the Jehovah's Witnesses, whether or not you can't, why does this internal scriptural process matter? Mr. Lloyd Evans, if I come to you first, and then Mr. Corbett.
I don't think any of us have an objection to the way Jehovah's Witnesses approach issues on an ecclesiastical basis, and have no objection to whether elders decide a certain individual gets to attend meetings or not necessarily. The issue is when the 2 witness rule impacts on the approach the organisation takes to the criminality of child abuse and whether it gets reported or not. And it's been argued by CCJW that the 2 witness rule has no bearing on the enthusiasm of Jehovah's Witnesses to report crime. The problem is that when we examine cases, that's not necessarily what we're seeing on the ground.
Right. So in the abstract, there is no problem. But the reality is that the idea of what's sinful and what's criminal is mixed up, potentially wrongly, by ordinary Jehovah's Witness. Mr. Corbett, if I could come to you.
It might help to put it into a specific example, I think. If you imagine a case where a parent goes to elders and says, my child has reported this behaviour, I think they're being abused by person X. What will happen is, if elders follow the policy, they will say to the parent, we are going to investigate this. In the meantime, be assured that you have the absolute right to report this to the police if you wish. Yes. That's your prerogative as parents.
Yes.
We will seek advice from the branch, and we will ensure that a thorough investigation is carried out. In that circumstance, it is likely that the congregation member will leave things in the hands of the elders, confident that they will do the right thing, and they will probably say, let's take a wait and see approach on whether I report or not.
Right.
Elders investigate, the person denies the accusation. All of this might take 2 or 3 days. They'll have called the branch for advice. They will be advised either to report or not to report based on the risk assessment carried out at the branch level. They will then go back to the parent and say, I'm sorry, there is nothing more that we can do. In a judicial sense, the person denies the accusation, there is no second witness, we can do nothing further. The interpretation of that from the parent's point of view is, we can do nothing further means nothing further can be done. The parent is not reminded at this point that when the elder says the matter has been handled, what they mean is the sin has been handled in accordance with ecclesiastical procedure of the congregation. What they do not mean is that the crime has been handled. The fact that they use terms like judicial, investigation, evidence, they use terms that are quasi-judicial in nature, assists with confusing these two things in the mind of the congregant, so that when the elder comes back and says, we've handled it and there's nothing more we can do, the likelihood of them then deciding, right, if you can't do anything, I will go to the police. There is no instruction for the elders to remind them at this point that they still have a right to go to the police. They are likely to go away with the impression that nothing more can happen on this case. And then those in fact are the cases that come back to bite CCJW in future years, because that child grows up, realizes they were cheated of justice and nothing has happened to their perpetrator 10, 15, 20 years later. And maybe by this time they've decided they don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness anymore. And now they say, I will take this into my own hands and I will seek justice where the system of Jehovah's Witnesses failed me. So although CCJW, I think if I can reference, it's in tab 9 and paragraph 76 in the first folder.
And this would be Mr. Gillis's first witness statement, if I remember rightly.
That's right, yeah. It's CJW 000052.
021. Danny, if you wouldn't mind getting up CJW 0000520221. Paragraph 76, I think you said, was that right?
That's right. So there are 4 categories here. Restrictions are imposed. So in other words, we put in place some safeguarding measures, and these are the 4 categories. It's determined the congregant is guilty, but they're repentant. So a judicial committee happened, but they're repentant. They were disfellowshipped and then they were reinstated. They came back sometime later. So again, their guilt was proven. Number 3, their guilt was proven by a secular court, yep, even though not by Jehovah's Witnesses internally. And 4, someone who was already a child abuser and then becomes one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yep.
So CCJW evidence suggests we've handled all the cases. There is a case number 5, the one we just described. The person is accused, they deny the accusation, it doesn't get to a judicial committee. There's a hanging accusation. Now we're into the territory where the branch has to advise whether or not restrictions are applied. The branch has to decide if that person moves, whether or not information gets passed on. So citing the 4 cases, which are actually the minority, distracts from the 5th case, which is most likely the majority case, that the abuser denies and there is no judicial committee. There's no proof, and we're trying to do CCJW a favour here by drawing this to their attention, because these are the cases where people come back and sue them a decade later, 15 years later, 20 years later, when this child becomes an adult and realises justice was not done. And that's not unusual. Statistically, two out of 3 people leave Jehovah's Witnesses at some stage of their life. It's a religion with a high turnover.
Okay, and that's one of the reasons why you're arguing that there should be mandatory reporting within the UK, so that in a way it gets taken out of both the parental hands and the Jehovah's Witnesses' hands, and things just get automatically reported to the police or the local authority.
And in that case, what is done ecclesiastically, as you said a few minutes ago, really doesn't matter. As long as the crime has been handled, Jehovah's Witnesses have religious freedom like everybody else. They can handle ecclesiastical matters however they like. They have that right, but children have a right too to be protected, and where one right impinges on the other, then surely it's part of the responsibility of the law to protect the right of the child to their childhood innocence, which effectively is stolen from them. One of the sad consequences of the 2-witness rule is effectively you're condemning a second child to be abused in order to be able to take some action. Again, the analysis from the Australian Royal Commission found that of those 108 appointed men, 53 of them were responsible for abuse of children outside of their family, and there were 131 victims of those 53 abusers. So clearly, many of them had abused more than one victim before something was done about the crime.
Well, and I think if one looks at the case of PRA 5, that's obviously an example of that having taken place in this context, in the English context, there being a situation, at the very least, one situation where that has been the case. If somebody is subject of ecclesiastical jurisdiction and then is disfellowshipped, which I understand is one of the consequences, is asked to leave, does the congregation know why that is? Or is it simply announced that they're no longer part of the congregation?
There is a single standard announcement which says the name of the person is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I know personally of a case of a man who was abused as a child, and the congregation believed that his abuser had been imprisoned for fraud. So even in the case where the abuser was found guilty in a criminal court and sent to prison, the congregation did not know what the reason was.
Okay. Now, as a consequence, obviously, of reporting allegations of abuse, you could be disfellowshipped, but you've all talked in all of your witness statements about the idea of, if you are the subject of that you could be the subject of disfellowshipping or disassociation if you made allegations of abuse, but they weren't proven, so to speak, and that can cause significant harm to those who are the subject of it. I don't know which one of you, Mr. Lloyd Evans, maybe, if I could ask you about that. And about
I haven't given evidence that you can be disfellowshipped for reporting child sex abuse. It used to be the case that we heard anecdotally that victims of abuse were told that if they were to go to the authorities, they would be liable for being disfellowshipped on grounds of slander. That's no longer the practice. In fact, there's explicit guidance in the current Shepherd book that that's not to happen. However, in the testimony of PRA 42, her testimony to the inquiry, her evidence indicates that slander does play at least some role in silencing victims and making them feel, or at least making elders feel as though they can't report.
Right. And I think I'll come on to discuss with Miss Gillis, Mr. Gillis, there's been a case of Mr. Whiteley where some of the elders were concerned
Indeed.
that if they reported it to the police, there would be those issues.
Indeed.
Yes, Mr. Corbett, your hand is firmly up.
Yeah, I think to be accurate, we would have to say that disfellowshipping, disassociation, or shunning can be associated with making accusations of child abuse. even though not necessarily a direct consequence. PRA 39 is a case in point. PRA 39.
Maybe it would be sensible for us to bring this up. This is
Yeah.
J000002 behind tab B18, Chair and panel. And it's sort of paragraph 11, 12 and 15. Danny, which is 003. So that's JWA 000002003. 11, 12, and then 15 on the next page, Danny. I made the decision, she says, to go to the police. It was a torture decision. The perpetrator was supported in court whilst I received no support whatsoever. This in and of itself, the culture. In the end, I was shunned by my father and my children. As a result, I've missed countless events of great importance to a mother. This no doubt affects the safety now. If they do not report, I've seen this work in practice, the risk of being shunned by their friends. Now, this isn't a practice which is condoned by the Jehovah's Witnesses. In fact, they expressly say, as Mr. Lloyd Evans identifies in their most recent Shepherd the Flock of God, that this shouldn't happen. But is this culturally what can take place in some communities? Mr. Lloyd Evans.
Just, it's very, very important to note that there are different types of shunning that might be thought of as formal or informal. So formal shunning would take place if someone is disfellowshipped or disassociated, but you can still be informally shunned if you are considered bad association. That was the case with PRA 42. PRA 42's evidence gives evidence of being ostracized by members of the congregation, even though she was never disfellowshipped. So just because there's a formal police investigation ongoing and the report has been made, she wasn't necessarily disfellowshipped, but she did find herself being given what might be called the cold shoulder treatment.
But obviously that's possible within the context of any small religious organisation. We heard in the Anglican investigation, for example, about a congregation which mounted a sort of a sustained campaign against two individuals who had made a complaint of child sexual abuse against their priest. That priest was subsequently convicted, but then even after conviction, the congregation in effect turned against those individuals and felt that they had behaved unfairly. So it's
the fact that it happens doesn't mean that it's right. And in PRA 42's case, it seems that some of the most obnoxious behaviour, or the behaviour that made her feel most intimidated, was being performed by the elders themselves. She gives evidence of being intimidated at a Kingdom Hall simply for attending her friend's wedding. So
for attending the wedding, PRA being the person in the Whiteley case. Yeah, and we'll come on to talk about that with Mr. Gillis. Mr. Corbett, do you agree with Mr. Lloyd Evans' analysis that there's a difference between disfellowship and disassociation and what might be called giving someone the cold shoulder, in terms of people not finding you terribly attractive? Mr. Corbett, we seem to have lost both Mr. Corbett and Miss Davies. I don't know what's happened. Miss Davies, perhaps you could help us with that.
Well, I absolutely agree with what Lloyd has said, is that when you are either disassociate yourself or you are disfellowshipped, shunning is a practice that's widely used and accepted within the JW community. I'll give the example of myself. I am neither disfellowshipped or disassociated, yet I am shunned within the community because I no longer attend the meetings, and specifically since I've reported formally sexual abuse. So, and I don't believe that is just the case of giving the cold shoulder. People will deliberately cross the street to avoid you if they see you and they've been part of your formal congregation. It's a deliberate act of shunning.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Corbett, do you have anything else you'd like to add about this? If you're there. It appears that we may well have lost Mr. Corbett, at least temporarily. I will therefore move on to you, Ms. Davies. There are 3 recommendations you make, one of which we've talked about with Mr. Corbett, which is mandatory reporting. The second of which is you consider that there should be an offence created of a failure to protect a child from a substantial risk of sexual harm. Could you tell us a little bit about why you think that would be useful?
I think going back to the examples that are given, that where somebody is accused and then there's no second witness and therefore no judicial committee is formed, that actually in order to protect those children, there isn't anything formal within that religion or within the current law that allows them to have that protection, because information isn't shared and it isn't felt that authorities should be brought in order to protect that child.
Right. And you also identified that there needed to be an independent safeguarding body. That was one of the recommendations you identify within your first witness statement, and you say that that should be independent of any religious organisation. Can you tell us a little bit about why you and your group, which obviously includes Mr. Corbett, have reached that conclusion?
Well, given the insular nature of the JWs and the familial culture within that organisation, it is felt that anything dealt with in the organisation is not, there's nobody, they're kind of marking their own homework in a sense, that they feel that they're getting it right. They are misguided by the fact that they are led by God's Holy Spirit. They're not trained in these specific areas with sexual abuse, and even in terms of supporting survivors. So in terms of making improvements, making adjustments, then it really does need the expertise and the specialism of somebody with outside of that don't have the same ingrained indoctrination and beliefs that the JWs have.
Right. I understand that Mr. Corbett's internet may well have gone down. That's why we don't have him. It may well be that we might need to take a break in a moment, but I'm going to ask Mr. Lloyd Evans. Mr. Lloyd Evans, are there any recommendations you would like the panel to make in respect of the Jehovah's Witness or in respect of religious organisations generally on the basis of the evidence that you've given, other than mandatory reporting, the implementation of a criminal offence of failure to protect, and an independent safeguarding body?
I echo the sentiments of the XJW Advocates Group and indeed the evidence that we heard earlier from PRA 5. This is a group that feels that they are answerable only to God. This is a group that reaches all of its decisions from America. They don't feel as though they need to yield to any regulations that are imposed on them. So not only do I advocate for mandatory reporting, but I advocate for this group to be regulated scrupulously so that all potential loopholes are closed off.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Corbett's internet has gone down, so I don't have the opportunity to ask him that question. I may well ask for him to be interposed, Madam, at some convenient moment so we can make sure that we have any recommendations from him. But Madam, unless there's anything further, those are my questions. Please, Ms. Davies and Mr. Lloyd Evans, if you'd like to wait here, the chair and panel may well have questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scolding. I have no questions, but I will ask my colleagues if they have questions. Ms. Sharpling.
No, thank you, Chair.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you.
And Sir Malcolm.
No, thank you, Chair.
That being the case, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses very much. I appreciate it's been a long day for you. Your evidence has assisted the inquiry and has been very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you both very much. Once we have Mr. Corbett back, I may well ask, possibly at the end of today, I'll try and stop slightly earlier than 4:15, if we can get him back, just in case there's any final words he would like to say to you, as obviously the technology has rather defeated us this afternoon. Thank you all very much. Chair and panel, I would now like to call Mr. Paul Gillis from the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses. Lee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gillis. Can you see and hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Gillis, sorry, can I just repeat that? Can you see and hear me all right?
Yes.
I understand you wish to swear on the Bible this afternoon, is that correct?
Right.
Could you hold the book in your right hand, please, and then repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God
By Almighty God,
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Counsel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gillis, and I appreciate and thank you again for your patience as you've been called slightly later than we had anticipated this afternoon. I thank you very much for that. A few introductory matters. Firstly, this isn't a test of memory. Please feel free to refer to your witness statement, exhibits, or any notes. You should have 2 very large files with you containing both your witness statements and a bundle of various documents, which I know you and others have prepared together. Secondly, you will be giving evidence for approximately 30 minutes, 20 minutes this afternoon, and we can have a break during that period of time if you need to do so. Your evidence will also go on until tomorrow, so in case I forget at the end, please do not discuss your evidence with any member of your team or anyone else, as you are now officially under oath. At various points, as you will have seen, I will ask a poor unfortunate gentleman called Danny to bring various documents up, and if the technology works, they will appear. If there are any references you wish to bring up, you will have seen this if you've watched the evidence today. It's always possible to bring documentation up if you need it. We have a number of witness statements from you, but before I take you to them, please could you give your full name and confirm your role within the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, whom I will, for brevity, simply call the JWs or the witnesses after this point in time.
Well, my full name is Paul Stuart Gillis, and I'm associated with the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses, having served here in Britain for many years at the branch office.
Right. And you've provided 4 statements to the inquiry. Your first statement is behind tab A1. It's 28 pages long and is dated the 2nd of December 2019. Can you confirm that you signed this?
Yes.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Your second statement is 19 pages long, dated the 19th of February 2020. I have it, no, it's not 19 pages long, it's approximately 5 pages long, and it's dated the 19th of February. And again, can I ask you to check, did you sign that statement?
Yes.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Your third statement is behind tab A3. Again, this is 13 pages long and it's dated the 11th of March 2020. Again, did you sign that?
Yes.
Is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief? And one then has your last witness statement, which is behind tab 4. And again, this is 5 pages long and it's dated the 7th of July 2020. Again, did you sign that witness statement?
Yes.
And is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Now, you indicated that you worked in the Britain branch office for a number of years. We'll come on to talk about that in a moment. But you were appointed as Director of the Office of Public Information of the Jehovah's Witnesses in 2018. Could you explain to us what that means your role currently is?
Well, the Office of Public Information shares accurate information about our beliefs and practices with the various publics, including the news media, academia, and also government officials.
And so you are based, or at the very least you work for, what I am going to call the US organisation, which is the central overarching body. Is that right?
I'm based at the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses in Warwick, upstate New York.
Thank you very much. And my understanding, and please confirm if I've got this wrong, is that guidance, information and spiritual teaching comes from the head office. That's then coordinated and disseminated to branches around the world. There is a Britain branch, which then disseminates the information to the individual congregations. Is that right?
Yes, although much of our information now is directly available on our website, jw.org.
And so, although you're not you have no hierarchy in terms of you have no ordained ministers, there aren't bishops or anything like that. You operate a fairly centralized system in terms of things are disseminated from the center out to the periphery. It cascades down, so to speak. Is that an appropriate way to describe how your organization works?
Yes, I would say that when you look at our structure, we model ourselves on first century Christianity.
Okay. And so, and your governing body provides direction and guidance, as I understand it, principally through publications, and these days through videos and YouTube and new media communications, if one puts it that way. And you have a number of documents, some of which we've already looked at, some of which are designed for the general public, and others of which are designed to be studied and used by congregations. Is that right?
Yes, except we don't use YouTube. We have our own JW Broadcasting and JW.
Fine. I don't want to get that wrong. But you were, for 12 years, you were a member of the branch committee. But as I understand it, the branch committee is the central body in the UK, which gives direction and organisation to local congregations. Again, is that right? Yes, that's correct. And you oversaw the activity of both what's called the service department and the legal department. Yes. What is it that the service department and the legal department do?
In relation to child abuse or just generally?
Well, maybe just a little bit generally, but largely in relation to dealing and managing with child sexual abuse.
So the service department cares for communications with our congregations. So you've mentioned a few things there, disseminating matters that come from our world headquarters. They also organize our conventions, they organize our schools, they organize our public ministry, they organize the care of our kingdom halls, and so forth. The legal department cares for, well, legal matters, which could be all sorts of things, property matters and so forth. But with regard to child sexual abuse matters, they give direction about the law, how the law relates to this subject.
And so we'll look at in a bit more detail about the role of those departments, but in brief summary, the service department and the legal department are responsible for the supervision and oversight of responses of child sexual abuse and information about child sexual abuse which are reported to them. Is that right?
Yes.
And as we've identified in the document we've already seen, they should be reported to the central branch. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, so when the elders first have an allegation of child abuse, two elders will phone our central office, based now in Chelmsford, and they will talk to the legal department, and that will get any applicable legal advice. And then the call goes through to the service department, who gives further instructions.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Just some further helpful background. I understand, and you say this in your first witness statement, there's around 130,000 members of the Jehovah's Witnesses in England and Wales. Is a member a baptised person or simply somebody who goes regularly to a kingdom hall?
Well, that figure is those who are either qualified as unbaptised publishers or baptised individuals. It doesn't necessarily include children.
Right. And when you say publisher, perhaps you'd like to explain what you mean by someone who is a publisher.
Yes, I need to clarify that, don't I? So it's somebody who, having studied the Bible with Jehovah's Witnesses for a period of time, maybe several years, makes a request to the elders that they would like to participate in our public ministry. So if they give evidence that they qualify to share in our public ministry, then they become what's called an unbaptized publisher. It's an interim step before an individual gets baptized.
Right. And can I just identify, can both men and women become baptized, and can both men and women become publishers?
Yes.
And you say there are roughly 1,500 congregations, as I understand it, in England and Wales. And is your organisation growing or diminishing in the 21st century in the UK?
Well, worldwide, we had 300,000 newly baptized ones last year, just over. In the UK, it is growing, but I don't have the exact figure, several thousand that would be.
And there are around 8.6 million congregants, as I understand, again, from your witness evidence worldwide.
Yes.
And again, as we've already seen when we had a quick look at the Watchtower with the individuals who just gave evidence, and as you've already identified, the model for your organisation is first or early second century Christianity. And unlike some other Christian religious denominations, you use extensive quotations from the Bible and scriptural assistance to guide the way that you run your organisation. Is that right?
Yes, we view the Bible as our constitution.
Thank you. So we've talked briefly about the structure. I'd like to just focus now upon the branch office. We've talked a little bit about the fact there's a service department and a legal department. Who staffs those departments? Are they Jehovah's Witnesses or individuals who you employ who have professional expertise, or both?
Well, those particular departments are staffed by elders, but also elders who may be solicitors, who are solicitors. And in the service department, we have the service desk, they're all elders as well. And they are individuals who have built up a degree of experience as elders over a number of years. They could be circuit overseers, as we will talk about, who have come to the branch office and are now filling that role.
Okay. So these individuals, are they remunerated for their services, or do they do this on a voluntary basis?
Now, we do all this on a voluntary basis. We are members of the Worldwide Order of Special Full-Time Servants, which means we get remuneration at the branch office for living expenses and so forth. But we're not paid, not salary paid.
Right, so it's a full-time occupation, but it's not one that's salaried. And you said that everybody is an elder. Can I just identify, so all those individuals who would both staff the service department and the legal department would all be men?
Yes.
Right.
We have women in those departments, but they don't take any of the roles that we're discussing in connection with child sexual abuse. They may, for example, in the legal department, just to clarify, we will have some of our women workers who deal with property matters.
Okay. So, and the branch office is run by the branch committee. Who appoints the branch committee? Is that something, do you have an election, for example, at your annual convention? Or how do you become how do you occupy the role you occupied?
Well, you have to have years of experience in being an elder. And now we have the arrangement where individuals go to our training school, which is based in New York, and they'll go through a 5-month course. And after they've been through that course, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses will decide whether to appoint them as a branch committee member, either back in their home country or in another country.
And again, they are all elders, so they will all be men.
Yes.
And as I understand it, they would be considered to be spiritually qualified, mature brothers. I believe that's the terminology you use.
Correct.
So, and you say that they all go on a 5-month course. Does part of that course, does any of that course involve looking at allegations of child sexual abuse or issues around child protection?
Well, what it does deal with is how to be a good shepherd. And that is the bulk of our work in connection with dealing with child protection issues. How to be a shepherd, or how to provide pastoral care, you might express it. So that's a very important facet of the training. And they will be given information that's familiar, to familiarize themselves with, say, the running of a branch office, and also policies that have been referred to in our shepherding handbook, as an example.
And so would the people in the service department or the legal department that might receive telephone calls, would any of them received any specific training in child protection?
When you say specific training, yes, they're given specific training as far as our policies and familiarizing themselves with our policies. and how to deal with telephone calls that come in from either distressed victims or from elders who choose to call in. So they'll be given that kind of training. We have individuals who've gained experience maybe over decades, and they may train newer ones in the sense of newer to that particular assignment, and they will sit in on weekly meetings in order to discuss specific matters, perhaps specific cases, if there is any, and that way they gain experience.
Right. I suppose what I mean by that is, do you have maybe somebody who's either a Jehovah's Witness or comes externally from, for example, the National Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, or from the local authority, or from other organisations who specialise in child protection, to come to provide you with any advice or assistance? Or is it all something which is managed internally?
Yeah, that's correct. It's managed internally because the training is for what we do as a religious organisation. I think it has been pointed out, and as I say in my statement, we don't really organise things where children are separated from their parents. We don't have the activities such as Sunday schools and they're going off on outings and so forth that's supervised by the congregation. So it's a very much a religious application of Bible principles. So that's why we don't have outside training. For example, how to assist victims of child abuse. So that's very much focused on the use of the scriptures to be able to do it.
So you don't have some other religious organisations that we've had evidence from, they will have a sort of child protection department that will often be staffed by people who may share the same religious beliefs, but who will have outside expertise in social work, usually social work, the probation service, education sometimes the law. You don't have that kind of department or that kind of arrangement.
Not in that organised way, no, simply because we don't feel it relates to what we do as a religion.
Okay, thank you. So we've heard a little bit about what happens at national level. At local level, we obviously have congregations, which meets at a kingdom hall. We've heard about that. And the body of elders ministers to them. Can you summarise from your perspective what the elders do in respect of every congregation? What's their job?
So their assignment involves taking the lead in teaching, taking the lead in shepherding those who need individual encouragement. They take the lead in our key activity, which is what we're well known for, evangelising work. So the elders take the lead in, those are the three principal areas, but they'll also meet as a body of elders from time to time to discuss the spiritual needs of the congregation, or to put into operation maybe some needs that are applicable locally. I think, for example, of the COVID-19. The branch office has given specific instructions about the use of kingdom halls, which are all closed at the moment, and the fact that we've stopped our evangelizing activity from door to door during this crisis. So these are times when a body of elders will implement the decisions, the instructions that they receive from the branch office.
And again, appointment of an elder is based upon, in effect, being, shall we say, an appropriate man within your community. I think that one of the citations from Titus is a man free from accusation, a husband of one's wife, having believing children who are not accused of debauchery or rebelliousness. An overseer must be free from accusation, not self-willed, not quick-tempered. So the assessment of suitability is based upon the scriptural demands as they are set out within Timothy and Titus, which I think are both books of the New Testament, if that's right.
Yes, you've cited 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1. If I could mention one other qualification that's considered, it's verse 9 of Titus 1, which says, holding firmly to the faithful word, which is the Bible, as respects his art of teaching, so that he may be able both to encourage by the teaching that is wholesome and to reprove those who contradict. So basically, before someone's appointed as an elder, they have to show that they love the Bible. They have to show that they have a good understanding of the Bible, and they've got the ability to teach well, as far as our teachings are concerned.
But they don't have to have any qualifications, training or experience at managing, shall we say, intra-congregational problems, such as, for example, dealing with child protection.
Well, you mentioned earlier the role of ministerial servants. So a ministerial servant is appointed first. Again, the qualifications are spiritual qualifications that are in the Bible. And once a ministerial servant has served for a period of time, could be years, then the elders look at that individual and say, is he showing the aptitude for being an elder in the congregation? So at that point, they might start to introduce some training in areas that I just mentioned to you, such as in teaching. Or they may have ministerial servants accompany them to visit people who have asked for some shepherding help, although that wouldn't be in the context of child safeguarding matters at that stage of their training. Right.
And again, those elders wouldn't have any specific training in dealing with allegations of child sexual abuse. They might have spiritual training in terms of scriptural advice, support and assistance, but there wouldn't be any sort of practical training necessarily. Am I correct in thinking that?
Well, the practical training is basically reviewing the material, reviewing our policies on child abuse. Such as has been mentioned, they get the shepherding or the flock handbook that's given to elders. They would go through that, which is giving them specific instructions about how to handle such matters. So we do train our elders according to our guidelines and our ways of handling allegations of child abuse.
Right. Okay. And we've already mentioned a ministerial servant, and I think there's been some description of them as sort of, they have some roles and responsibilities, largely administrative or you know, moving things around, making sure everything's clean, but they're in a way sort of elders in, would I be wrong to describe them as elders in waiting, in that they're given that appointment and then in a way they're sort of half trained up, or they look and see whether or not they are capable of being elders? Is that right?
Well, commend you for doing your research. Yes, indeed. Ministerial servant, elders are appointed from ministerial servants. So, but the ministerial servant may be a ministerial servant throughout his life and never be appointed as an elder. It's not as if you serve for X amount of years and then you're appointed as an elder. They have to meet the qualifications of an elder.
But again, are all the elders, do any of them do it on a full-time basis, or is this a part-time voluntary position?
An elder is a part-time position. I mean, those of us you mentioned that work at our branch office, well, we're doing that activity full-time. But as far as elders are concerned, there is no clergy laity class in Jehovah's Witnesses. There is no salaried individuals who are elders in the congregations. We have circuit overseers who will travel from one congregation to another, and like those who work at the branch, they will be reimbursed for some of their expenses by the congregations as they visit. But not paid salaried assignment.
And the last kind of role I wanted to talk to you about is the circuit overseer. So as I understand it, 20 congregations make up a circuit. We're used to hearing about circuits as Methodists and lots of other non-conformist organisations also use that group themselves in a similar manner. And there's somebody called a circuit overseer. Who appoints circuit overseers, and do they have any particular roles and responsibility in respect of child protection?
So they're appointed by the branch. They go through training. We have our school for kingdom evangelizers, and they have to have gone through that school. It's a 2-month course. It's not specifically designed, of course, to deal with child safeguarding matters. But again, they are people who are well versed in our policies on those matters, so that if they're asked questions about our policies when they meet with the body of elders during the course of a visit, then they're able to explain our policies. And
I think we've got lots of examples of your policies and practices. We'll talk a bit later about some of the individual policies you have in respect of child protection, but generally elders are meant to follow those practices and stick to them with quite strict adherence. Is that right? So things which are issued should be followed. They're not, you know, you can do this if you want, you don't have to.
Well, that's when it comes to organisational procedures.
Yeah.
If you're talking about helping people on a personal level, you know, we try to help individuals to reason on Bible principles. So it's not as if elders give instructions as to how a person should live their lives. If a person's looking for guidance in the congregation, we educate our elders to understand the principles that are involved and to share those principles with individuals so that they can make good decisions in their life.
And can I just double check, we've talked about there not being any sort of child protection department centrally or locally, because it sounds as if you don't have an elder who's in charge of child protection, for example.
We feel that any elder can be approached on child safeguarding matters. So any congregant can feel free to talk to an elder about their concerns.
And again, circuit overseers don't have any particular responsibility for child protection, is that right?
Well, as they visit congregations, they don't get involved with matters with individuals in the congregation because they're only there for a week. And usually with helping for a victim, well, that's a shepherding that may have to go on for some period of time. But they're well versed and well experienced in our principles to be able to give advice if the elders have questions about a matter or their understanding of the policy.
So do circuit overseers undertake any kind of auditing function? Are the congregations ever audited in any way or monitored either by the overseer or by the central branch, either by the overseer's visit, which, as you said, takes place twice a year, or by somebody from the branch coming in to say, you know, you're doing a good job or you're not doing a good job, or I think you need to improve this? Is there any of those kinds of oversight or auditing or monitoring facilities available?
There is auditing as to how financial matters are handled in the congregation. There's an example. Their main purpose is to go and spend a week encouraging the congregation. So they take the lead in the speaking from the public platform. They will take the lead in doing our evangelizing work during that week. But they'll also make themselves available if there's an individual in the congregation that wants to talk to them about a personal matter. So he'll be accompanied usually by one of the elders and talk to an individual.
Okay. But there won't be a sort of checklist. Sometimes in some other religious organisations we've seen they'll go in with a checklist and they will ask, have you done this? Have you done that? Are your policies up to date? Have you, you know, various things from, you know, the sublime to the ridiculous. You don't have any process like that.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do have a checklist that we give to circuit overseers.
Right, okay. And does that involve anything to do with examining or auditing child protection, or is it more about other matters?
They don't really audit child safeguarding matters, no.
Thank you. I think I note the time, Chair, and I'm also conscious that Mr. Corbett, I believe, has returned from the technologically dead, so to speak. So if I may ask, if I may leave it there with Mr. Gillis and thank him very much for the evidence he's given to date. But Chair, with your permission, may I revive Mr. Corbett and ask whether or not he has any final words he would like to say, and if you have any questions for him. Mr. Gillis, I just remind you, you're under oath. But thank you very much, and I'll see you tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Very much.
Mr. Corbett, I don't know whether or not you're out in the technological ether. If so, please would you unmute yourself and show yourself on video, please.
I am glad to be resurrected.
Thank you very much. And I'm so sorry that there were obviously technological difficulties which led to you falling off the call before the end of the opportunity to have your evidence, and we're very glad to be able to get you back now. The questions that I asked the other witnesses whilst you were offline, so to speak, were about recommendations. And we talked about an independent safeguarding body. We spoke about the need for mandatory reporting. And we spoke about the need for a criminal offence or failing to, in effect, pass on allegations of child sexual abuse, or concealing such. Do you have any other recommendations, or is there anything you would like to say about those recommendations to the chair and panel?
Yes, could I just clarify what I was in the middle of saying when I was
Yes.
cut off? It was about the aspect of shunning, and what I was trying to clarify was that in the example of PRA 39, which I happen to know well, this person left the organisation as a result of being abused as a child. When she finally took her abuser to court because it wasn't dealt with by the congregation, her father refused to support her at the court case, and said, "Why do you not leave it alone? Why do you have to bring this up?" Because he felt it was bringing the congregation into disrepute. He now has hardly anything to do with her unless it's a case of something he needs, which no member of the congregation is able to supply for him, and then she's last resort. So is she shunned because she reported child abuse? Well, not strictly. Did she leave Jehovah's Witnesses because of child abuse? Yes, she did. Is she shunned because she left Jehovah's Witnesses? Yes, she is. So there's a direct link, although you could argue the semantics of being shunned because of reporting child abuse. And this sort of case is not uncommon, where somebody chooses to leave because they can't live with the organisation that did this to them, and then as a result of leaving and perhaps being outspoken about what happened to them particularly, then they get shunned. And in this case, the person is not disfellowshipped or disassociated, but is still shunned by members of her family as a result of having left. On to recommendations. Yes, mandatory reporting for the reasons we talked about, because it takes the decision making out of the hands of amateurs and puts it in the hands of professionals who can deal with it. It does exactly what CCJW suggests that they wish to do, which is to separate the crime and the sin. Let the religion handle the sin, let the police handle the crime. Seems very sensible. With regard to publishing of figures and auditing of those figures, I think advice that CCJW themselves published is very good. There's an Awake article which is referenced in one of their elders training letters. Strangely, it's missing from the list of references that they sent to the inquiry, because it deals directly with child abuse. I'll just read you one paragraph, if I may. This is from the Awake of the 8th of April 99. It says, "Think of the heartbreak of parents who have discovered too late that their children have been abused by trusted clergymen, teachers, or even close family members. It would be good for you as a parent to ask yourself, does my church tolerate or cover up child abuse? Is my religion holding firmly to high moral principles? Answers to such questions could help you to make wise choices in protecting your children." I think those are exactly the questions parents should be asking themselves. The problem is, without external reporting, how do I know whether my church is tolerating child abuse? If there are no figures available to me as a member of the church, how do I know? If there are figures, but they're not audited externally, how can I tell the difference between a church that is not tolerating child abuse and one that is just very good at covering it up? Without external auditing, there is no way of telling the difference. So I would say this advice, which comes from CCJW themselves, is excellent. If parents want to do this, then they should have at their fingertips the information they need to be able to assess the risk posed by a particular church to their children. And that would require all churches, including CCJW, to publish publicly the statistics. How many cases are reported? How many of those are against people in positions? How many of those were reported to the police? What was the outcome of the cases? all of this should be available to anybody who is a prospective member of that church.
Thank you very much, Mr. Corbett. Chair and panel, I don't know whether you have any questions for Mr. Corbett.
I have no questions, and I don't believe my colleagues have any questions. So I assume that's the end of today's evidence.
Yes, it is, Chair. It's the end of today's evidence. With your permission, if we may resume again at 10:30 tomorrow morning.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Golding.
Thank you.